Hello and welcome back to Popcorn Chat. Hope you guys are doing well. As you can tell, I'm still here with David from Well Good Movies, and we're going to talk about the previous films within the Roald Dahl sort of universe. You know, the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory from 1971 and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory from 2005. And we're going to compare that with Wonka, which we've seen today, and sort of how they sort of stand up, you know, as a collective films. So let's start off with the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. I mean, this was the first film I saw. I don't know about yourself, David, but this was my introduction into the sort of whole story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I used to watch it on repeat. I've got, you know, really old-fashioned DVD over there. I used to love it. And I remember just falling in love with, like, Gene Wilder, even at a young age, and sort of the sarcasm and sort of magicalness of the whole film, which maybe doesn't stand up by today's standards when you sort of pick it apart. But to me, it's always going to have a special place in my heart because it was the first film that I saw. What's your relationship with the film?
Willy Wonka wasn't one that I ever kind of experienced through like my parents or, you know, on TV or anything. It was more that I seeked it out, and maybe it was on television one day and I was like, oh, there's an adaptation of this. So I recorded it, and then I had it recorded on a VHS. So that's another thing you say about old-fashioned DVDs. There's a recording of...
Even older here.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I didn't sort of love it, I guess. I kind of found it just such a strange mix of kind of like what cinema was like at that time in the 70s. I felt the music was kind of like, again, very Disney-esque, but kind of oddly placed. Like you said, I think the Gene Wilder definitely stood out to me, and that was like the standout. But then there was just so many moments in the film in which I was like, what's this about? And like maybe as a kid I was like, oh, I just, you know, goes over my head. But then even as an adult I was like, no, that is strange. You know, so it's like the fizzy lifting scene, even the ending, the fact that it just comes down to like a contract negotiation. So I think all of that always stood out to me. Like obviously I remember that, you know, the Oompa Loompas and the like pure imagination. I think all of that is like the best parts of it. But yeah, it was never one to me that I kind of like, I've heard so many people like you who've kind of been like, that's one of my favorite films ever. It never stuck with me. I sort of I've remembered it, but not from a kind of like, that's one of my favorite films point of view. It was more just like, I remember that, I watched it, but it's more in the way I would have watched something like Never Ending Story or something, which I'm like, yeah, I acknowledge that people like that, it's a thing, but I never personally connected to it as much.
Yeah. It takes so long for Charlie to get to the factory, and bloody Mr. Slugworth everywhere. Like, how does he pop up in these places? Like, oh, Charlie just finds the ticket, and then boom, he's right round the corner. There's so many things. I think a lot of people don't like Slugworth.
No,
I think that's correct.
It's one of the things that this kind of like forced into the film, is this element of like more stakes and more like, drama, which then comes through at the end, which the other film's kind of guilty for, of like trying to add more to the story, because the book is quite a simple story. So you can see how they've both approached it. But yeah, I think for me, that it doesn't come across quite as well in Willy Wonka, because it just feels so out of place in terms of this. Because to me, like the story is always about like these greedy children and how they're different and greedy in different ways.
And their parents.
So you didn't also need to add on to that by saying, oh, well, they're also like greedy because they're going along with this Slugworth guy.
Yeah. It doesn't add anything to these characters already.
And there's also the often unrecognized villain of the film, which some people say is Shady Grandpa Joe. So
he's the true villain.
So I think that when, again, growing up, I've seen people react to it in different ways. People have said that they prefer the depiction of Charlie in this film because they find it a more realistic portrayal of him. But I never kind of related to this Charlie. I think the Cheer Up Charlie song especially kind of represents it, because I think that, I think you can have too much on the other end of being too idealistic and too much of a perfect child. But this idea that like Charlie in this film feels he's entitled to this ticket, and he feels he should get it, and he's like really like angry about it. I've seen people like, and I think it's a perfectly valid opinion to say, well, yeah, that's like what a child would feel, and they feel like that it's unfair and they want it, and you know, why can't it be me? I think that is a good case to make. But I don't know, it's maybe something about the performance or the way that it's written into the film. It comes across as just too kind of selfish, and makes me feel, is Charlie different enough from these other children? And I think the fact there's a song literally then called Cheer Up Charlie, is just like, really, you know, come on. It's so, and I think at the end of the day, Willy Wonka needs to see something in him which is different, and that's what makes the end of it so funny. And I think that these days we talk about like memes and stuff like that, and this film has definitely led to a lot of great stuff in that sense. Exactly, yeah. The horror elements. I think that even though people...
The boat ride.
Yes, people would definitely say well, look at what the Tim Burton film is, but we'll get on to that. Yeah. But to me, that tunnel scene is terrifying.
Like, I think it scared like our parents.
Yeah.
When we watched as kids, like it doesn't matter, what generation technology we're in, that will always scare people, I think.
And I think it's the idea that the makers of that film, to me, like Tim Burton, it's kind of saying, well, this is who I am, and we're going to have this weird, eerie element to it because it's a dark story and it's a dark filmmaker, and it's sprinkled in throughout the film. But to me, Willy Wonka has always been like a nice, happy time horror film for 5 minutes, then back to normal. So the fact that Gene Wilder's there with the flashing lights and a chicken is getting decapitated, I'm like, what is this doing here? So that to me has just always made it just such an odd film.
Yeah.
I just find it so strange.
That's the 70s though, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. That's the thing.
I guess one of the iconic things with the original that, even with the Wonka film we've seen today and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like, is the songs. I think the songs always hold up, minus Cheer Up Charlie.
Yes, yeah.
I think they're pretty sort of iconic. I've Got a Golden Ticket.
Yeah.
The Oompa Loompa songs, though they are literally all the same, but they change a few things, whatever child's, turned into a blueberry or whatever.
Yes.
They're all pretty similar, but I think they've always sort of stood out across 50 years now.
Yeah.
So I think that's what makes the first one so special, I would say, is the music, because it's interesting because it's that era of making all films musicals, and I've really felt that with the Cheer Up Charlie. Might have like some kind of Oliver or something like that. I was like, I don't know if this is right, but I think it finds its feet once they're in the factory. I love those songs.
Yeah, I think the context as well is tricky because Roald Dahl was alive when that film was made, so then that's why he was like unhappy with it.
Yeah,
and unsurprisingly, because even in the book there's an entire song or character which is about like why television is bad for children and stuff. So then they go and make a film version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But yeah, I think that you can definitely see where he was coming from in that they tried to Disneyfy the story, and those songs, I think, like Pure Imagination, like they've used it within adverts. And there's a musical version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory,
there is.
And it has all original songs apart from Pure Imagination, and it makes sense because it's in the musical, and you're like, well, yeah, because it is. They don't do Oompa Loompa songs, but they do have that song, and you can see why, because you're like, it is an incredible song, it's brilliant. But it's kind of like what we said about Wonka today. It's within its own world, within this kind of like magical Willy Wonka world. It does fit. Does it fit within Roald Dahl, creepy twists, fantastic Fox stuff? Not so much, but that's also what happens with Roald Dahl stuff. People love Fantastic Mr. Fox. That's not a Roald Dahl story. That's a Wes Anderson film.
Yeah.
But it's how people adapt it, I think, which is always interesting. But I think to me, the Willy Wonka one is more of a kind of product of a studio as opposed to like Charlie and Chocolate Factory, which is a bit more director-led, which is interesting. Obviously, once you get in the factory, there's a lot of crazy stuff like
Alice in Wonderland, like the small corridor. That's what reminded me of.
The chocolate room never looked that captivating to me in terms of like, I don't know if I would want
when they first go through.
Just in terms of like, the actual room looks fun, but I don't know if I'd want to drink that water. Like, do you know what I mean? The CG chocolate looks a lot more appealing than that chocolate, which looked like brown. I
think it was some kind of chocolate. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. Maybe it's diluted.
Yes,
watery,
it didn't look as appealing, basically. But the wallpaper they lick and stuff is quite funny. But it's again like you'd be like, ugh, and that random like bubble machine. That they just drive on.
They just shrink and then come out.
But I think it's fun when they're wearing the white suits, and
I love that.
Is quite similar to the the later version with Tim Burton. So I think that there's a lot of visuals that stand out still within that film. Something I do like as well is how the Oompa Loompas obviously have their costume with like
it's iconic, isn't it?
But when they're then in the TV room, they have like the white suits, but they still have the fuzzy ball things on their feet.
I think it holds up. You can pick it apart.
Yeah.
Obviously, Roald Dahl infamously didn't like this film. I've not read the book, so I can't comment. But my takeaway from it was I enjoyed it. A little bit slow to begin with. But I think it still stands the test of time.
Yeah, I think it deserves this kind of legacy. It is a fun film and it's got a lot of iconic stuff. I think it's just in terms of like, is it my favorite one? controversially no.
Well, so I guess that brings us on to the 2005 film Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which was directed by Tim Burton. Now, I was 10 years old when this came out, so it was like perfect to see, you know, in the cinema. I absolutely loved it. I alluded to earlier about not being any merch for Wonka, because I remember seeing this film and there used to be Wonka bars in the shops, like everywhere. And I think they did do a golden ticket incentive to it. But what was your sort of initial thoughts on this film?
Yeah, very similar. Like, I think because, as I said, Willy Wonka never kind of like struck a chord with me as much, and this came at the perfect time because I was delving into more certain directors, and I can't remember what sort of led me down this Tim Burton rabbit hole, whether it was because I liked Night Before Christmas as a kid, so it was perfectly timed. So I was kind of like you, seeing all the merch. At that time, it was like when websites were just like one page, and they had like the visuals of the film, which were all kind of like candy sweet themed, and you could like preview the songs, and there was character posters for each one. So there was definitely like a hype surrounding it. And I've always said to people that, you know, even though some people, like my co-host Craig, is just like baffled by my enjoyment of it, I think that I always say, you know, I am a bit biased because I think it came at quite a relevant time for like my family and stuff like that. So I guess I kind of was more attached to it because I remember going to see it in the cinema with my mum. So that made it a bit more special. My granddad also, Grandpa Joe in that film really reminds me of my granddad. Like, he's like a small sort of like man, and like, you know, he's more like kindly and, you know,
big glasses.
You know, not well. My granddad didn't have big glasses, but he really reminds me of my granddad, Grandpa Joe, in that film. So
yeah, very different to the original.
Exactly. Yes. So I think that I really connected with this one a lot more because, again, I like Tim Burton. I like Danny Elfman. I love his score in this film. Oh, yeah. And I think that's when I first saw it. I was really captivated by the beginning of it. This like do do do, you know, and it goes into the funnel, and you don't even get that much these days with films. You don't have an opening title sequence. No. But I remember seeing behind the scenes, and I think it's his daughter or granddaughter, Roald Dahl's. You know, the Dahl estate was more involved in this one, and I think that was clear. And I think that one of the Dahl children's described it as it's Dahl meets Burton. So I think it's good that they acknowledged that it still wasn't this perfect adaptation. I don't think you ever could, like I said before about Fantastic Mr. Fox and things like that. People will always have their own spin on it, but because I like Roald Dahl, because I like Burton, those working together, it's a fun film for me. So I always liked that Johnny Depp just did his own thing. It is really weird, it is really strange, but I kind of like most Tim Burton stuff. I kind of excuse it because I appreciate the originality, and it does make me question, like, oh, that's weird, or why are you doing that? But I like that I'm being challenged in that way, I guess. I like how the dad is in this one as well. Yes. And again, even though people say, oh, well, this version of Charlie, who's Freddie Highmore, is a lot more perfect and more like an innocent child. But to me, that does work because that's ultimately what the story is about. You feel more connected to him. You want to back him, I think, more in this film than the first one. Like, I like that moment in which, you know, this is what I was alluding to in the Wonka review, which is where we're talking about the chocolate in that just seemed magical, just out of nowhere. Yeah. And there's that scene in which, like, sometimes I think I relate quite a bit to Mike TV, in which he's like, why is everything in here pointless? But the fact that Charlie then says, well, candy doesn't need to have a point. That's why it's candy. And I've always liked that way that then Johnny Depp's Willy Wonka looks at him, because he has that moment like, yes, you are the one. You don't have that in Willy Wonka. I don't think he just kind of goes, yeah, you've won because you're the last one around. And I think I like that he saw something in him rather than just saying, he says even in the Tim Burton film, he says, oh, the least rotten would be the one who wins the prize. Yeah. But I feel in this one that they actually say he's the least rotten, but also he saw something in him, which was good. So I like at the end of the film how they come in and they're brainstorming, they're working together. Yeah. Charlie's had his ideas. There's more legitimacy to his character in terms of him having his ideas and cherishing the chocolate. Like I said, he has the chocolate bar, he splits it between the grandparents. I like the other grandparents have lines. Yes, the other grandparents, like the other granddad is really funny. Yeah, exactly. I can't remember his name, but just his comments when they're watching the TV. Yeah, Grandpa George. Yes. Yeah. So I like his line, which is, he's like, somebody offered me $100 for the ticket. And I always love his line. And this was kind of like stuck with me is, you know, even though Grandpa Joe is a fantastic character, you know, he has that great, like, yippee, and he's like dancing around. I like how Grandpa George says to him, like, there's plenty of money out there. But he says, this ticket, there's only one of these in the world. Are you going to give this up for something as, feeble as money? And he's like, so wipe your pants, get out there. You got a factory to go to. I like that element of it. It reminds me, I like that element of, as being somebody who's not as materialistic, of being like, there's plenty of money out there. There's only one ticket like this in the world. And I like that element as well.
But yeah, my sort of positives are very similar to yourself, David. Like, I think the family dynamic surrounding Charlie is so much stronger in this film. Helena Bonham Carter and the dad, like they're such a lovely little couple, and they just carry on. We don't have that whole bit where she works somewhere else, like she's doing the cabbage and the cleaning there, and like you say, the grandparents have more to say and more to do in this. Grandpa Joe is much more likable, definitely. He seems genuinely, he wants it for Charlie, not for himself.
Yes, yeah.
Which is obviously, I've got a golden ticket, is all about very selfishly sort of thinking about
and
that.
even at the end of the film, they say that before he accepts Willy Wonka's offer, they start to turn their life around, which is also nice. It's this element of like, they're poor, but that doesn't then, Willy Wonka isn't a savior of them being like, oh, well, I've now helped these people from a rags to riches story. They actually start to turn their lives around themselves before he accepts the offer.
Yeah.
So when it goes back to them and like it says, Grandpa Joe like spent the whole day out of bed and he didn't get tired once, and he's like sweeping up, they mend the roof, they have like a nice family dinner. I was like, I like that. I like how they say that regardless of Willy Wonka, they still are thriving.
Yeah. So how do you think that these two films prior to Wonka have influenced the film we've watched today?
Well, I think I thought it was interesting in the trailers, especially, and seeing behind the scenes photos before Wonka come out, that there was like snow and the look of Timothy Chalamet's Willy Wonka to me looked almost a bit more Johnny Depp-esque, like in the fact that, obviously each version has got like a version of a purple coat, but to me it looked a bit more Johnny Depp-esque without the weird hair, but like just the idea of like the combo of like a sort of blackish brownish hat and a more crimson-y velvet coat rather than like a full-on purple. And the fact that there's snow everywhere again, which is a very Tim Burton thing. So I feel that's where the visual elements of Tim Burton is coming through in this film, but the kind of magical musical elements from the Willy Wonka one is coming through. They bring in like the mother character, which is never, Willy Wonka's mother's never established. So they get around the fact that even if you do want to see it as canon with the Tim Burton one, his father's in that one. And while I do think that is maybe always feels like Willy Wonka, we talked about how the Slugworth stuff is kind of like oddly placed. They kind of add this father element to add drama to the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory one. And it is strange, but I love Christopher Lee, so I can't like not.
He's got the perfect voice, and then to be the narrator as well.
And to have the glove thing as well. I'm like, oh, perfect. I love he's a dentist, so he has the rubber gloves and they're both like squeaking. So I like again, this film just goes, don't talk about the dad, because you can still think, yes, Christopher Lee is his dad. Sally Hawkins and Christopher Lee had a baby. That's good.
What a world that is. I feel like there's some kind of Freudian thing going on there. It's got mum issues, dad issues.
Exactly.
It's all going on.
I did think throughout Wonka, I was like, I think the other films potentially like, it's a nice treat. Whereas Wonka seems to advocate for like, you can eat chocolate every day and you'll be fine. And like, this town is definitely getting diabetes at some point.
I mean, we only saw it with one character really, who sort of really took it to an extreme. Gosh. I guess my sort of, if I'm going to really put you on the spot here, David, which one do you think is your favourite out of the, let's say the three that we've seen? What would you say is your favourite depiction of this world?
I think it's hard to say from what I've just been talking about. The Charlie and Chocolate Factory 2005 isn't my favorite, just purely because it was just at the right time. I like the style of it, I like the music, I like the performances, and just the vibe of the film. It's just, I have a lot of fun with it. I definitely appreciate and respect Willy Wonka, and I think it's got a lot of great moments, and the same with Wonka. But to me, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is the closest to like a Roald Dahl experience, I would say.
I think on rewatch this time, and sort of reading more into it and how it's more of a faithful adaptation, the 2005 one, I think I enjoyed it a lot more. I enjoyed it as a kid for its silliness, and I love the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then from an analytical point of view, I think this is a better film than the Willy Wonka film, even though obviously I'm still going to enjoy it. But I think I've definitely boosted my rating of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory to a higher, just on level with that film. So as a whole, it's better. The first one will always have nostalgia,
That's
I
the thing.
think. But yeah. And then the Wonka film, I enjoyed it, but I don't know. It's too early to say,
Yes,
like,
yeah.
if it's going to stand the test of time.
The
But yeah.
struggle with that one is it's not going to have that classic like five children factory.
Yes,
Each one gets
yeah.
like punished.
The
so,
morals
yeah,
of the
it's
film.
not going to have the kind of like storybook element. I think, which
Yeah,
it is,
yeah.
as good a prequel as you can make. It's never going
Yeah.
to have that kind of narrative structure.
I'd say so. So yeah, I think we're both agreement on this one that the
Yeah.
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory 2005 is the best one.
Yeah, interesting.
There we are. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know what your favourite Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Willy Wonka film is down below in the comments. And why don't you tell everyone, David, where people can find you?
So you can catch me on Twitter at David Osger, also on Letterboxd. I think it's D Osger, but if you search my name, obviously there's not many David Osgers around, so you can still find me on Letterboxd at David Osger or D Osger. There I kind of just review most things I'm seeing in the cinema, and then on Twitter also I'll talk about Well Good Movies, which you can catch on Instagram, Twitter, which is at Well Good Movies, which are our podcast, and we just talk about films throughout history, anything from 90s, 80s, 40s. Each film leads to the next one, and we always look about it in terms of its legacy, and we decide whether it goes into our vault of movies to be remembered. So fun times. You've obviously joined us as well. So yeah, and we're just now wrapped up the year, so we'll see what the next year has ahead.
So everyone can go back and listen to everything you've talked about this year.
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Well, make sure you go and follow David and his podcast if you aren't already. It's amazing. And I'll see you guys very soon for another popcorn chat. Goodbye. We both just went.
Yeah.